Thank you.
When Marx defines the ideal as the material transplanted into the human head and transformed into it, he does not in any sense understand this head in the naturalistic way of the natural sciences. Here we mean the socially developed human head, all forms of activity which are the essence of the products and forms of social and human development, directly social and commonly significant forms, starting with language, its vocabulary and syntactic system, and ending with logical categories. Only by being expressed in these forms is external matter transformed into a social fact, into the property of a social being, that is, into the ideal. The direct transformation of the material into the ideal consists in the fact that the external fact is expressed in language, this immediate reality of thought, that is, the ideal. The language in itself is as little ideal as the neurophysiological structure of the brain. Again, this is not the ideal, but merely a form of its expression, its substantive and objective being. Therefore, neo-positivism, Wittgenstein, Carnap, and others like them, which identifies thought, that is the ideal, with language, with its system of terms and utterances, commits that very same naturalistic error as those doctrines identifying the ideal with the structures and functions of brain tissue. Here too, only the form of its substantive expression is taken as ideal. The material is really transplanted into the human head, and not just into the brain as an organ of the individual's body. First, only if it is expressed in directly meaningful forms of language. Language here is used in the broad sense of the word, including the language of drafts, diagrams, models, etc. And secondly, if it is transformed into an active form of human activity with a real object, and not just a term or an utterance as a material body of language. In other words, the object is idealized only where the ability to actively recreate the subject based on the language of words and drawings, where the capacity to transform words into deeds and through the deed become the thing has been created.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's many thoughts-provoking things in there. So yeah, if anyone does have a question, I certainly have a few questions there. Lars?
Well, I also have actually many questions, but I'll start with the word transplanted, which is the very first meaning. What does that mean? You know, it seems to me that it expresses some kind of conveyor thing, you know, that something is transplanted from the outside into the human head and then transformed it. Is this how we should understand this, or it seems strange for me that expression, and it comes back later in the paragraph as well.
Yeah, thanks. Olga? You're still muted at the moment, Olga. Nope, still muted. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I have some notices to the phrase that is not, it seems to me that it is not exactly translated. The direct transformation of the material into the ideal consists in the fact that the external fact is expressed in language, this immediate reality of thought, that is the ideal. But the language is not the ideal itself, but just its body. It seems to me we need this in the preposition of, reality of thought, that is of the ideal. In other case, it seems that the language is the ideal. And the second moment, the next phrase, again, this is not the ideal, but merely a form of its expression. It not substantive, but tangible, just tangible and objective being. Maybe this will clear something for you.
Thanks. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions? Or any ideas about, because I agree, one word I have trouble with is transplanted, and the other one is head, the human head.
Well, I have a problem interpreting part of this. What about neo-positivism? No, I'm not aware that Carnot and those people even deal with the brain or the body, but rather with a detached syntactic concept of logical statements. So that seems to be the problem with the positivists. And I don't really understand what's being said in this paragraph about them.
Yeah, just to quickly return to that, I guess so. What Wittgenstein and Carnap have in common there, in terms of this particular topic, if we think of the later, well, so the early Wittgenstein is obviously the famous "the limits of our language are the limits of our worlds," where a lot of the things in terms of his logic, actually, the whole problem is that his logic isn't constrained by the way in which the world really is. So you can kind of say anything you like within the logic. And then he himself kind of realized that, and then in the late Wittgenstein, he basically has used theory of meaning, which you might say, well, okay, that's about activity, but basically he thinks we should do away with ideas like meaning in favor of use, that use should replace meaning or ideality in this case. Carnap's idealism is interesting because he is interested in actual empirical phenomena, the logical bottom there, in terms of which he hopes to express every every phenomena which is observable. There is the observation, and then underneath that there's going to be some ultimate structure by way of which it's going to be explainable. There's some extra something else, basically some kind of foundation on the basis of which, so whether that foundation is language or a formal language or a term, I think that's what Ilyenkov is talking about there. But yeah, with the head, I wonder if he meant, if he almost kind of imagines it as a sort of a node or like an assemblage, or anyone have any comments about the words transplants or any other parts of this paragraph? Okay, Bill. You're still muted, Bill.
Lars had his hand up too.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
come back to
yeah,
Lars.
sorry, yeah.
Bill first.
Okay, okay. Just wanting to underline the last sentence of the paragraph, which seems to really get to the nub of things. And I'm just trying to link it to this morning with drama teachers. I was discussing the Aesop fable, The Hare and the Tortoise, and how it might be used by drama classes. And I just wonder whether the story of the Hare and the Tortoise ascends to ideality, or whether perhaps it's only in drama that the story becomes ideality, because drama is much more activity than reading the story. So, tough question, sorry.
May I say some words? Maybe Ilyenkov was.
I think Lars was.
I would like to,
Yeah,
to say
okay,
that
okay.
maybe Ilyenkov was not quite exact in this respect, in respect to the doctrines of Carnap, Wittgenstein especially, but he meant that their understanding of logic, which expels contradiction, yes, reduces this logic and their understanding of thought to the linguistic matter, to the linguistic substrate of thinking. That is why he thought that they reduced the ideality to its naturalistic material, naturalistic understood material.
Thanks. Lars, then Sasha.
About this head, then my very simple interpretation of that is simply mine. You know, the way that your neural structures change in social activity, and that, of course, is then related to what kind of activities you're involved in and what kind of language you had, etc. So I think, yeah, that's how I see it. Anyway.
Thanks. And Sasha.
I have a comment on this paragraph, but not to the quality of the translation, but on the contradiction contained in Ilyenkov and Marx themselves. When Ilyenkov comments Marx's definition of that the ideal is the material transplanted in the human head, Ilyenkov obviously disliked this definition, but his comments were weak. And because he only stressed the head we have not to understand as the human organ, but as something which contains a culture, background, etc. But even in such interpretation, Ilyenkov stays in entirely idealistic understanding of the ideal. When he equals the ideal with something which we have only when we discuss something social, something which is connected with language, with science systems, etc., etc. But in his big work, The Dialectic of Ideality, Ilyenkov formulated the idea which leads him to materialistic understanding of the ideal. When he said that all these things like flags, symbols, etc. are ideal, but the first thing which is ideal is a tool, a just material tool. And first of all, tool, writes Ilyenkov in his Dialectic of the Ideal. Definition of Marx based on Feuerbach with his physiological materialism, which Ilyenkov criticized as physiological idealism. This is the relict of Feuerbachianism in Marx. And Ilyenkov overcomes this weak formula of Marx only with his formula that the tool is the universal example of ideality. I realize that this statement needs to be more fundamentally argued, commented. But I propose to make a report just on this topic lately. Thank you.
Thanks. And Karina?
I think the word transplanted is a bit difficult. I agree with Paul said put in the chat, it could be better translated maybe as transposed. I'm not sure what the German original was, but it does help, as Olga says, to understand substantive as tangible.
Mhm.
But I don't really, I mean, maybe I've misunderstood Sasha, but I don't think that there is a contradiction here, or that it's an idealist formulation at all. I don't, Ilyenkov is stressing the fact that the ideal is not identical with flags and things like that. That is not the ideal. That is a receptacle, if you like, a form of it, but it's not. Its ideality, as he says, only consists, as in the paragraph, in the sentence at the end, its ideality only consists in the activity of the human being. It's not in the object. And the whole point is that the object, for Carnap and these people, the object becomes the thing. I mean, they conflate language with the ideal. And it's not, that isn't, it is not, that language is not the other, it's a kind of, it's a thing that human beings have developed, a physical way of expressing themselves. But the ideal aspect of it is that activity of expression rather than the language itself. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I respond to what Klaus said?
Sure, yeah. Oh.
Cecile's asking.
Oh no. Okay. Cecile does. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think again to come back to this kind of like transplanted and the whether or not it's the right thing. I kept on thinking very recently there was an English translation of Galperin's work into you know, like I can't remember what the title is, but basically it's a very detailed observation of processes of internalization in learning and how teachers can guide learners into internalizing, and I think there is an example about Armenian churches or whatever. But the point is that that's from that point of view, the transplanted doesn't really work quite well, because actually what Galperin has studied is this very, very detailed process of an activity becoming ideal and idealized in the mind of the learner. So yes.
Yeah. Anyone else before we move on? We'll have a look at some of the other work here.
May I try to answer to Lars?
Yeah.
I think, Lars, that Ilyenkov uses this Marxian phrase as a metaphor, but he meant human individuals as collectively organized, their activity as which has a collective form, ensemble of social relations. This is the real subject of all this process. And in this text, there is one word in the very end, the last phrase. In other words, the object is idealized only where the ability to actively recreate the subject. Ilyenkov, in Ilyenkov, this rather object, because who must recreate this object? Individual, acting individual, and he recreates outer object. So the real subject of this process is human individual, but he moves in the collectively imposed forms implanted during his bringing up, so to say.
Thanks. Any final comments arising from that? Or anything we haven't covered yet about this paragraph?
Well, just a very quick one. I was just thinking about who is actually doing the transplantation. There must be an active subject doing this activity. To me, this is an important question. Because it says in the first meaning there that the ideal as the material transplanted into the human hand, somebody must doing that transplantation, or what you call it. I think so. So if you could ask that, if you could answer that question, it would be much more clear to me. But we can take on that later on, maybe.
Suresh, did you want to say?
Yeah, two things. One, to Ralph's comment that he wrote, I don't see that neo-positivism addresses the brain. So I don't think, if I am understanding Ralph correctly, so I don't think Ilyenkov is saying that neo-positivists do that. He is saying that neo-positivists commit the same kind of mistake that the naturalistic, that people who understand the ideal in naturalistic way do. They do the same by identifying the ideal with the language in a different way. So I think he's saying that, not saying that neo-positivism does that. And second thing that Lars just said about who is doing the transplantation. So it's quite clear, I think it has been running throughout his whole essay from the very beginning, that it is a real human subject to engage in practical activity in a particular social and historical context. So that, I think, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
I agree. I think it's maybe like asking, who gave this £5 notes the value of £5 the overall system. Okay, so any volunteers to read the next paragraph? Yeah, great.
I can read it. I can read it.
Oh, I think Lars.
I had actually another question, but maybe we should move on to the next paragraph. But
okay, well,
yeah, it was this concept about commonly significant forms, and later on he talks about external facts, and he gives some examples like the language, drafts, diagrams, model, etc. How should we understand those commonly significant forms? Can we get some kind of simple explanation of that?
Yeah, I think we can come back to that probably after this next one to think about why they're commonly significant after the next paragraph. Yes, Suresh, were you saying that you were happy to read the next paragraph?
I'm sorry, may I say?
Okay,
in Ilyenkov's text, in this place, a bit different phrase, not rather different, but he wrote that these are forms of social human development. Forms of social human development, what Lars underlined as forms, commonly significant forms of social human development. Maybe it will be clear for you.
Thanks. Okay, so shall we read the next one?
Shall I read it?
Yes, thanks.
Spinoza understood this perfectly, having established that thinking is the activity of the thinking body dealing with real bodies in real space and not science or concepts connected, adequate, expressed by words with that very ability, the capacity to reproduce the given form, the geometric contour of these words in a real space, the object of this idea. It was with this understanding that he based his distinction between the definition expressing the crux of the matter, that is, the ideal image of the object, and the nominally formal definition expressing that the casually plugged out feature of this object, its external sign. He explained this difference using the example of a circle, its circumference. The circle can be defined as a figure such that all straight lines drawn from the center to the circumference are equal. However, such a definition does not in the least explain the essence of a circle, but solely one of its properties. Furthermore, the properties are derivative secondary. It is another matter when the definition encompasses the immediate cause of things. Then the circle should be defined in the following way. The figure described by any line whereof one end is fixed and the other free. The latter definition provides a means of constructing things in real space. Here, the nominal definition emerges together with the real action of the thinking body along the real spatial contour of the ideal object. In this case, the human has an adequate idea, namely of the ideal image of things, and not merely signs, traits, verbal expressions. This is a deep and materialistic understanding of the nature of the ideal. The ideal exists where there is an ability to recreate an object spatially, relying on the word, on language, in a combination with the need for this object, plus the material support of this act.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, so we have different comments or questions here, or we can link it back to Lars's earlier question by thinking about what does it mean by the human to have an adequate idea, or yeah, any other comments or questions about this section. And Ralph did make a comment in the chat, which you can read.
May I say to Ralph? Ralph, I would agree with you in large scale, because Ilyenkov himself, maybe it was later, he made more clear this notion of ideality. He, как сказать, уточнял.
Clarified.
Yes.
He made it more accurate, more nuanced.
Specified.
He added to this Spinozian point of view that we cannot explain ideality and thinking and their происхождение, emerging, yes, when we take an individual and just nature, just one single individual which moves around the contour of object. For this, we need Marxian position that not nature as such, but nature which is attained, which attained the stage of the socially producing his life human. And only in this complexity, in this complex system, we may see the magic retorta, where the ideality arises. And you are quite right against this definition of ideality, of mathematical objects too. Ilyenkov point does not cannot be reduced to this point. He just appreciated Spinoza's step.
Yeah, so perhaps it's almost, this paragraph is almost a distraction in some ways, but does anyone else have a question or comment about it?
Mm,
Lars?
Yeah, it's just an idea that this section is much about. It is related to anticipation. If if you take a model, for example, as one of the example of the external facts that it was given earlier, a model is modeling something that does not really exist before we act. You know, we want to think about something that we can achieve in the future, some kind of object. So I was thinking, is this about anticipation as well? This paragraph here, to foresee something that does not really exist as yet.
I just saw someone with a hand up and then I forgot who. So if you just had your hand up a second ago, let me know again. No.
I would like to add about translation. I
Okay.
see that this is unclear phrase. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm worried about it. The first sentence, the second sentence, this long sentence and the complex construction is not quite exact because yes, having established that thinking is the activity of the thinking body dealing with real bodies in real space and not with science or concepts, he connected adequate ideas expressed by words with that very ability, the capacity to reproduce in a real space the form of the object of this idea, the geometric contour, which is prescribed by these words. This is the Ilyenkov's sequence, because in Juliana it is a bit inverted and it seems to me not exact.
Well, I have worries about it in that case. So we've got an adequate idea, and part of that criteria is the ability to reproduce what is ideal. But that again sounds to me like you have some kind of external foundation to judge what's adequate. That sounds again like a Carnap type of thing. So there's recreate or reproduce as in there's a constant ongoing process. So there are people who are always involved in I don't know, making pots, therefore they're constantly reproducing what it means to create a pot. Or because this is a paragraph about things like triangles, etc., is he saying that it somehow forms, there then exists something to be reproduced, like a pot, in the same way that there was a circle, that a circle became something that can be reproduced once the compass was invented, as like available to humanity. If that's not interesting, we can go to the next paragraph, or does anyone have a, oh, sorry, Corinna, yeah.
Thank you. I think we could get throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because I think Spinoza, Ilyenkov, as Olga was saying, Ilyenkov is just explaining Spinoza's idea here, and Spinoza was, as we know, was in struggle against medieval philosophy, the nominal point of view, which is that reduces everything to names or signs, as he says. Not everything is reduced to signs, and the content of the sign is obliterated. So he's really saying that he's talking about truth, actually. How do we know the essence of a circle? How do we know the essence of things? Is the essence of things, does it consist of a description of some features, one or two features? For we can apply this to political issues today. Because some political leader has some features, does that mean because Trump has some features of fascism, does that mean he's a fascist, for example? Is that an adequate explanation? Does that tell you much? Does that tell you the essence of the thing? And Ilyenkov says, no, it doesn't tell you the essence. The essence has to be investigated through human knowledge, through human, penetration of the object or of the thing in study. And therefore, it's not, external description is not adequate to get to the essence of things. That's the point he's making. Whether the drawing of a circle is not the greatest example, he's just using that from Spinoza, and he's going to move on from this. So we shouldn't get stuck there too much, I think. And the bottom line is that essence is actually movement in movement. There's something in movement, human activity in movement, discovering the essence of things. So I think, of course, that there's undoubtedly problems with the formulations, but I think that we have to see Ilyenkov, what he's drawing something from Spinoza in order to build on it.
Thanks.
I'll volunteer for the next paragraph.
And finally, I think Sasha had a comment, and then we'll move to the next paragraph.
Thank you. I insist it's a mistake to associate ideality with human sociality. Animals are also social. The notion that animals are zoological individualists is an illusion going of New Age philosophy. Ideality is a more fundamental category. Ideality appears with the emergence of life, not with human. For life is nothing but the capacity of one living body to act on the form according to the form of all other bodies. This idea of Spinoza was rediscovered by Ilyenkov. It's also the basis of Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. Man doesn't differ from animals in that only he is aware of ideality. The difference of human's ideality is the universal capacity of a human being to reflect the world in forms of ideality, not on his natural body, but in form of unnatural body, неорганическое тело. That is the basic distinction between the humans and animals. And when Ilyenkov repeats these lists of examples of ideality with symbols, etc., just in these points, he makes very wrong he's wrong. Just all these things are ideal, but the problem of ideality is not a problem of terminology. Ilyenkov insists that the concept of ideal has to help us to understand how we, as thinking subjects, can find the truth, truly understand the world. And the way when we appeal to something social, we just positivists appeal to arbitrariness. We explain the ideal as symbolic form. We appeal to Hegel with his idea of Namengebungskraft, the ability to give names. But this is a dead end. Marxist way, appealing to material tool. Only with material tool, a human person a human subject acquires the ability to act according to all forms of all things in the nature. That's all.
Okay. Thank you, Sasha. So it's worth saying there are many debates within Ilyenkov's scholarship, and Sasha definitely takes one really interesting position within those debates. So there are those who would stress more the role of Hegel and recognition within the ideal, and who might, perhaps draw lines.
First of all, I stress Spinoza.
Yeah, so we can see how the Spinoza line is here in this passage, and then there are those who, perhaps trust Hegel more and interpret the inorganic body of man in a slightly different way. But yeah, it's a really interesting debate to come back to. Should we have Miguel? I think you said you were happy to read the next paragraph. Thus, the definition.
Yes, I continue. Thus, the definition of the ideal is deeply dialectical. It is that which is not, and nevertheless is. It is that which does not exist as an external, sensuously perceptible thing, and yet exists as an active capacity of humans. It is being which, however, is equal to not being, or the present being of an external thing in the face of its becoming in the subject's activity, in the form of the subject's internal images, desire. Yet it is also fundamentally different from the physical and material structures of the brain and language through which this thing exists within the subject. From the structures of the brain and language, the ideal image of an object is fundamentally different in that it is a form of external object, and not a form of the brain or language. The ideal image differs from the external object in that it is not directly objectified in the external substrate of nature, but in the organic body of man and in the body of language as a subjective image. Consequently, the ideal is, thus, the subjective being of the object or the other being of the object, the being of one object in the other and through the other, as Hegel had expressed this situation.
Thank you very much. So again, interesting paragraph with lots of interesting ideas. I don't want to take it down this tangent unless maybe Bill has ideas about this, but it straight away kind of made me think of various psychoanalytic ideas. I was just at a seminar using how Samo Tomšić reads concrete abstraction, so real abstraction, and this idea in Marx of objects talking to each other in ways that sort of subjectify us. So there's all kinds of things that you can probably expand on in ways that are not what Ilyenkov was going for, but it seems consistent with all kinds of things that you could potentially say, I think here, from a psychological point of view, even though he's not making the simple psychological point here. So yeah, I wonder if anyone had a comment or question or response to anything here. Penny.
I just wanted, I was reading this previous paragraph about, Spinoza's view of the presentation of the, what is a circle, and that he says the knowledge of the circle is the ability to reproduce it, and therefore that's the fixed point and the thing going round. And that made me think about, I don't know if any of you have seen them, but all across Scotland where I live, there are these prehistoric cup and ring carvings on stones, thousands of them. And there they are, they exist, they are circles. They were created by people who would not have had a metal compass, but they would have had the ability to conceive of a circle. And this conception of a circle has obviously come from their life as very early, human beings living in that part of Scotland. And these we look at those circles and we study them, and as a result of this study, we can have a rich concept of what these circles are. They exist physically. They also exist as an ideal. But the point I wanted to make was that they must exist in time, because for us, we develop this understanding of these circles, these stone circles, from our own social, political, and physical and cultural standpoint. And that has to be different from the social, political, and cultural standpoint of the people who created these incredible things. And therefore, language as a fixed thing is not adequate to explain these things, because all of this, the object itself, a product of human culture, and the humans, we all exist in time, and language changes over time, and understanding changes. I mean, we have a totally different understanding of these objects than the people who made them, because we speculate that they had a religious significance, but we don't know that. So we can, we're looking at it has to be understood as the ability to create these circles came out of their social, religious, and cultural existence. So this ideality, this ideal is, it's a dialectical and thing that arises from our existence as human beings. I'll find a link to some pictures of these amazing things.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. It reminds me of, I love the T.S. Eliot quote about every new great artwork remaking every artwork of the past through its adoption into society. Any other comments or questions about this part? Lots of interesting things about structure that are then being negated in some ways. I mean, so I'm writing about this with Karina at the moment and thinking about dialectics and how is a dialectical approach different from a usual approach. And I think one thing in terms of structures where I find it helpful to think about it is that, and again, where he's making the comparison with Carnap, or even with saying everything is a language game and forgetting what a game is that most of science, certainly the vast scientific consensus of his time, would try to find a system. So where's the system? So AI was all about mapping the system of the brain so we can simulate the brain through mapping. Well, it's now called good old-fashioned artificial intelligence because we realize that's not going to work. And I think what's really interesting here is it's about contrasting against thinking about it as this sort of flat system within which everything is expressible in terms of this, priority language or end language, and the idea that the body of man and in the body of language as subjective image is an interesting kind of counterpoint there against traditional systems approaches. Oh, thanks, and Penny's pasted there. This forgotten art. Yeah, that's really interesting, and lots of circles before compasses were invented. Any other comments or questions about this paragraph, or shall we do one more?
Lars has got his hand
Lars,
up.
yeah.
I'm not quite sure which paragraph we are talking on, but this is the paragraph that begins with thus the definition of the ideal. Yeah, okay. It's deeply dialectical. So I'm curious about the relate of this dialectical relationship. What's on both sides of this dialectical relation? It seems to me that one side is the individual neurological brain, and the other these external facts or commonly significant forms. Is that how we should understand the dialectics here?
Brina?
That's one aspect of the dialectic. I saw the dialectic as the fact that it both is and is not, which is a hard thing to get your head around. The first sentence, it is and is not, and yet it is. I mean, that's a toughie, isn't it? That's a pure Hegel, of course. But it's how can something exist that isn't sensuously perceptible? We can't touch it. We don't. It's not a stone. It's not an artifact. It's not a book or something that you can put your finger on. But it does exist. So he's challenging us to think about what that could be. And in other words, if you have a book has a lot of ideas and ideality, ideal thinking in it, but it's not the ideal because it's completely dead. It has absolutely no meaning. It's just a piece of paper, same as a £10 note has no meaning as a piece. It's a piece of paper. It is only acquires ideality by human beings doing things with it and projecting their desires onto it. That's why he uses the word desire, in the form of a desire, which of course leads us on to the next section, which is about commodities and fetishism and so on. But he's just stressing that the ideal does not consist in the symbol. The symbol is not the same as the ideal. So you're right, Lars. I mean, there is a dialectic of between the individual and the external object. That is a dialectic because it's a relationship of two opposite things, or objects or people or whatever. I mean, you and I are opposites, and we have a relationship between each other which is dialectical. You are my other, aren't you? You're my other, and I'm the other of you. And as Carol says, the activity of the objects makes us into subjects. So there are these, all of these are dialectics. But I think the question of not being is really important. Not being something that is but is not at the same time is something that is in movement and change, which human activity by its very nature must be. I would disagree with Sasha saying the birds a bird's wing is ideal. Yes, it's ideally shaped for flight. It's a beautiful example of evolution in action and the adaptation of nature to a purpose, which is flying. And it's ideally adapted to that, yes, but we understand it as ideally an ideal thing. In that sense, the ideal does exist outside of us, but we recognize it as being ideal because we know its history, we know its beauty, we can appreciate it. We can appreciate it in action by being a bird in flight.
Suresh.
Sorry for going on.
No, that's great, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Corina said because, and what Olga added, that the dialectic consists precisely in the fact of its being constantly being in motion. It is and it is not. And the moment you remove you try to understand it in any static or fixated form, then the whole concept loses its meaning. So yeah. The dialectics contains in that, in its very motion.
Yeah. Yanis, and then Andrew.
Yes, I have a question. I'm not sure during all this conversation, maybe it's my fault, when we are talking about the German ideal and the other term ideale, because if we are talking for the concept of beauty that Hegel elaborates and analyzes in his Aesthetic, is something else. It's not exactly the same with the other concept, ideale. So I would like to. I'm not sure that I understand all the comments because I have a permanent confusion that what we are talking about, which one we're talking about. I think I agree with Sasha. Ideal is not something that characterizes uniquely humans. Engels, for example, says in Dialectics of Nature that wherever a protoplasma exists, or the cells are a form of ideality, are a form of ideal. And I would like to mention also Hegel, that for Hegel, the main concept and the main paradigm of ideal is the organism, is the being that it refers to itself. So it's a kind of purposiveness. So if we want, to my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, if we want to understand the ideal, we have to analyze the ideal in the evolution of animals and how the purposiveness develops itself and acquires different level of ideality. For me, in humans, we're facing the mature form of ideality, but not the unique.
And Andrew.
Obviously we're covering an awful lot of ground, and there's a lot of questions about, well, what are we really talking about, which is always a good question. I think the crucial thing we're really talking about, that Ilyenkov's really talking about, is the relationship between thought and being. It's extremely abstract. That's a very, very abstract issue. Now, in this thing that we're reading, he has set it up to some degree, because if you go back to what we've read in previous weeks, he tries to set it up through talking about Plato and history of philosophical ideas, and he sets it up in terms of different traditions, materialist and idealist. So he has set it up, but he does set it up more sharply in his book Dialogical Logic, and there you really get to see what he's talking about. And he ultimately is talking about trying to overcome the problem of thought in being as articulated by Descartes. That is what is at stake ultimately in the way Ilyenkov develops these ideas, maybe a little bit more than you can actually see in this essay we're reading. That speaks to a lot of what has been said. It speaks to, well, what is the dialectic here? I mean, yes, it's all the things we've talked about, but it's also the dialectic between thought and being. It speaks to Penny talked about sociality and so on and so forth. That's all true, but right now we're not dealing with we're dealing with a fundamental issue of truth. That is another way of putting it. How does the thought and the being become identical in some way that we call truth? So these are the sorts of issues at stake. And I suppose one way of then articulating what the problem Ilyenkov's trying to overcome is this, yeah, well, it's dualism, and dualism feeds into idealism. Ilyenkov argues that Hegel is fantastic, but ultimately on this key issue slips into a form of Cartesianism. You'll see all of this in the dialectical logic chapter. But you know, this is actually quite different from what Lars is saying in terms of is it the sort of the head, the physiology, the neurophysiology, and the external object. Well, it's much more abstract, much more. It's about this thought being. Universality is another aspect of thought. I mean, just the other thing to say is, yeah, there is a big debate about this. I mean, and Sasha is a key player in this debate, and I broadly agree with Sasha's position on this against people like Oyton and Medansky. So what the circle example I think is extremely important. It's not something which is neither here nor there. This idea of the circle, I think that's a very, very important. So I'm laboring all these points because these paragraphs are the critical ones. We can go on, but it will not get us any further in terms of the key issues. The only way to get any further on the key issues, it would be to read dialectical logic, where it goes into a bit more depth. So I don't want us to think that these are kind of minor issues. I think these are the key ones. Sasha's made some critical comments. The idea, I suppose the other thing in terms of this idea with the animal, human, and natural, inanimate, that is also in play in the debate between Sasha and Medansky and Oyton. These are, I mean, there's some point where I definitely don't agree with you, Sasha, in terms of where you take this. I sometimes sit between Medansky on the one hand and you on the other. I want to develop to Hegel. I want to develop to beyond thinking body, but I agree with nearly everything you say about thinking body and mode of activity. So these are all the key issues in play right here with this essay. I'll shut up now.